Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on our 8th session of our 2022 Racial Justice Training Series. My name is Ebony Howard. I'm the Deputy Director at the Gault Center. In each of our sessions this year, we have explored a chapter in Professor Henning's book, Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. In our past sessions, youth defenders, impacted young people, youth justice advocates, and academic scholars have joined Professor Henning in discussing the impact of government systems on and societal bias on Black, Latino, and other groups of young people who have historically been subjected to racial or ethnic prejudice. Using Rage of Innocence as a foundation, past panelists have discussed adolescence, including the basic characteristics of adolescence, the importance of recreation and play for young people, youth expression of culture, youth identity development, and the importance of education for young people, all within the context of how America prohibits Black and Latino youth from benefiting from these life stages. Last month, we had a powerful discussion on Chapter 7, which was on contempt of cop, where we delved into how law enforcement and the juvenile court system unfairly casts acts of civil disobedience and protest by Black and Latino youth as criminal behavior and illegal defiance. For today's panel, we'll be talking about Chapter 8 of the book called Policing by Proxy. And we'll be discussing the roles that everyday citizens who are motivated by racial bias play in criminalizing Black and Latino youth when they step into the role of law enforcement to accuse young people of crime. We will explore the role that different technology plays, as well as the mechanisms of the justice system that aid citizens in victimizing youth. So to introduce our wonderful panel today, we're not going to read their full illustrious bios. We're going to drop those in the chat for you. Instead, what we're going to do is I'm going to read a very brief part of their bios, and then I'm going to ask them in 60 seconds to explain why they're passionate about this concept that we're talking about today, policing as proxy. So we're going to go in alphabetical order, and I'm going to start with Tom Bahr. Tom works as a public defender at the San Diego Primary Public Defender's Office. He's worked as a public defender for his entire 13-year career. Throughout his career, Thomas has tried complex and serious felony cases, including homicides and sexual assaults. Thomas spent 3 years learning the law and litigating cases on behalf of youth in the Juvenile Justice Division of the San Diego Primary Public Defender's Office. It was during that time that he met his client, Edgerrin J, and litigated his case along with his co-counsel. In his spare time, Thomas participates in criminal defense organizations in San Diego and enjoys spending time with his 2 young children and wife, Emily. Tom is also here despite having a baby who is on a 2-hour nap. We are thankful for this time that you are giving us, because you should be doing something else. Thank you so much for joining us, Tom. And Tom, in 60 seconds, can you tell us why you're passionate about this issue?
Yes, I think policing by proxy enables and encourages people to act upon racist stereotypes in pursuit of the outcomes that they desire in the criminal justice system. And I think that has no place, or should have no place, idealistically, in the criminal justice system that we're all involved with.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom. Wonderful point. Next, we'll go to Dr. Noël Cazenave. Noël, as he has allowed me to call him, just want to make that clear, I got special permission, is a professor of sociology at the University of Connecticut and is also on the faculty of the Urban and Community Studies program of the UConn Hartford campus. He is also a faculty affiliate with UConn's Africana Studies Institute, Department of Philosophy, American Studies program, Humanities Institute, and Sustainable Cities program. His recent and current work is in the area of racism theory, U.S. poverty policy, political sociology, urban sociology, criminal justice, the sociology of emotions, and kindness theory. He has authored numerous articles and books. His most recently published book is Killing African Americans, Police and Vigilante Violence as a Racial Control Mechanism. Thank you so much for joining us, Noël. Can you tell us in 60 seconds why this issue is important to you and why you're passionate? And you're on mute too. You're still on mute. Uh-oh. Still on mute. Okay. There you go. Awesome.
The short answer is because I have eyes, a brain, and a heart. I have eyes with which I see that African Americans and Latinx young people have been hunted like wild animals, as if for sport. I have a brain that tells me that these incidents are not accidents, misunderstandings, or driven by fear, but are instead a criminalization-based mechanism of racial control that for African Americans goes back to the American debt peonage system of economic exploitation. And finally, I'm passionate about what I see and understand because I have a heart that bleeds with each killing of our young people whose only crime is often the dark color of their skins.
Thank you, Noël. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Chris Henning is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown. She has represented young people in DC Superior Court for more than 3 decades. She has inspired and taught an untold amount of youth advocates, including myself. She trains a wide array of justice stakeholders on the role of race in the juvenile legal system. And of course, she is the author of Rage of Innocence. Chris, can you tell us in 60 seconds why this issue is important to you?
Ditto everything that's been said, but I will add that if I am serious about decriminalizing Black adolescents and letting Black and Latino children be children, then we have to talk about all of the ways in which all of us, everyday civilians, criminalize Black children and Latino children and other children of color, not just the police officers. So policing by proxy is that, the ways in which we all individually stand in the shoes of those in a blue uniform.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Jason Tashea. Jason is a writer and entrepreneur and law professor making sense of law and technology. A lawyer by training, he is the director of the newly formed Judicial Innovation Fellowship Program at Georgetown and a consultant for the World Bank on access to justice and technology issues. He was most recently a product manager at a justice technology startup and an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, where he created and taught a practicum on criminal justice technology, policy, and law. Jason, welcome, and please tell us in 60 seconds why you are passionate about this issue.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I want to do what Chris did and echo everything that's already been said and add that this issue is where my career started. I started after law school in juvenile justice reform in Baltimore City, Maryland, which has all of the issues involved in it that we're going to be talking about today. But now, as far as my work is concerned, I care about not covering up a broken system with a glossy digital interface. And that is, I think, of what we're going to talk about today. Technology gives us this opportunity to better what we've done before, redesign it and improve upon it. But time and again, we keep seeing that we just hard code the existing biases and problems into these new technologies, which is what we're going to be talking about. And I'm excited to be talking about today.
Wonderful. All beautiful points. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm super excited. Let's just dive in. So as we normally do, we're going to set the stage for this conversation by starting with Chris, and starting with the basis of the chapter. And so, Chris, we know that all of us of all races, all ethnicities are responsible for the way that we respond to Black and Latino youth. And so we know that through our history, we've all have played some kind of role in the way that policing is administered on youth. And so I want to start with you talking about this term of policing by proxy. You know, like you called the title that. Maybe some folks have heard it, but a lot haven't. And so can you just tell us, what does it mean and why did you call the chapter that?
Yeah, so I think this ties directly back to sort of why I'm passionate about the conversation. So much of the conversation about the criminalization, the killing even of Black and brown children focuses on police officers in a blue uniform. But really, we are all in some way or another complicit at the very least, and often active in sort of that policing and criminalization of Black and brown children. Think about all of the ways in which we as individuals buy into, for example, the stereotypes, the narrative, the language of fear, right? The ways in which we individually, and I keep using we on purpose, but we weaponize law enforcement and other surveillance technology that Jason will talk about against Black, Latino, Asian, and Indigenous populations. We call 911, we rely on these sort of crime watch apps. We support, right, corporations that are profiting off of this commercial surveillance equipment. And so I really, this notion of policing as proxy, I just think it's just like a perfect example. For me, I wasn't very familiar with the term. It just resonated with me. But when I then did a search for the term, there are even some case law that talks about policing as proxy, the ways in which we police officers rely on civilians for policing, for their, we'll talk about this, informant tips and things of that nature. So I just think policing by proxy is a perfect, it's just a perfect way to describe what we're talking about. And then I just want to say, weaponizing, when I use the language weaponizing law enforcement and surveillance technology, that sounds really nefarious, right? And it sounds like something that the average listener who cares about Black children and other children of color wouldn't do. But I want to challenge us in this 2 hours, right, to think about the day-to-day reality. We have to ask ourselves why it is that we are afraid, just afraid, why these ways in which we buy into the narrative. We walk into a park and we're afraid of a Black child in a hoodie. Right? Whether we do something about it or not, that's sort of the foundation of this policing by proxy, this sense that we look at that Black child and think they're dangerous and that they don't belong in that park. That's in a way policing by proxy, right? Because it leads to the next step, maybe of picking up a 911 call, of making that 911 call. What assumptions are we making about Black children being involved in a gang, just because they're hanging out together, maybe even dressing alike, right? That also is the foundation of this narrative of fear. That is really the heart or the start of policing by proxy. So it's a challenge to all of us.
Fascinating, like absolutely fascinating, thinking about the role that we all play in it. Like even those of us who think that, we are above that, right? And so I want to come back in a little bit to this idea about the role that all of us are playing. But first, I really want to tease out this idea that was in the chapter that that is about the vigilante, right? And so like when I first thought about the idea of a vigilante, I had this view of like Charles Bronson. Those of you who are a little older know who Charles Bronson is. But this hero that, shows up and, takes justice into their own hands for the good of everybody. And I immediately started to think when I was reading the chapter about Bernard Goetz, who in 1984 in New York on a subway shot 4 teenage boys, Black boys, and at the time, the media heralded him as the avenger of us all, right? And America loves a vigilante, loves someone who takes justice into their own hands, and that can have disastrous consequences for other people. But I'd really like you to help us, tease this out. Like, what is it about America and this vigilantism type of trope?
Well, it's interesting. I would just say, look, from American folklore, you start talking about that. We thought about vigilantes as superheroes, right? Not even just think about cartoons, Spider-Man, Superman, Wonder Woman, right? Literally, the superheroes were vigilantes, the good guys taking down the bad guys and gals, right? Protecting, the local residents and taking justice into their own hands. But even in real life, right? Like you say, right? We've applauded civilians like Bernard Goetz who take responsibility for making their communities safer, right? Think about like the guardian angels. You talk about, Bernard Goetz, but think about like they emerged in the late 70s and the early 80s to combat crime in New York City and then spread internationally. Think about sort of neighborhood watch programs that also began in the 1970s. So there's always been this sense, right, that like there's value into people solving, their own problems or handling, making their community safer. I think it's the best way to think about it. But the problems arise, and this is where we run into problems and get really at where Noël was taking us. But the problems arise when neighborhood watch and other civilian interventions are rooted in racial bias and faulty and inflammatory narratives about Black and brown youth, when society condones, right, civilian violence, right, as a form of appropriate vigilantism, rooted, quote unquote, in fear. And this is really important, the problems arise when supremacist organizations manipulate vigilantism and hide behind these false claims of fear in order to terrorize Black and brown people. So historically, vigilantes look like the KKK, and they look like the lynch mobs who were quote unquote protecting, white space, white resources, white women, white power, right, from this terror of the, of the African American or the Black American. So that's historically. Today, vigilantes look like George Zimmerman, right, who of course shot and killed Trayvon Martin. They look like Michael David Dunn, who shot Jordan Davis at a gas station because he was listening to loud rap music. They look like Travis McMichael, George McMichael, and William Bryan, who killed Ahmaud Arbery. And they look like Kyle Rittenhouse, to be quite frank, who crossed over state lines, right, to protect businesses, right, in a Black Lives Matter protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So, we've got problems. What started off as heroism has really become something else, colored by, the protection of white space and this manipulation, this false manipulation of fear.
Yeah. And in the book, in this particular chapter, you talk about the role of police in this too. And so there's this quote that you have in the book that says, "Police silence in the face of civilian brutality against Blacks has implicitly sanctioned vigilantism as an acceptable form of law and enforcement." What does police silence look like? I mean, I think some of us think we know, but like, what does it look like? And how do police sanction this activity, sanction this this vigilantism?
Yeah, look, so I'll say it this way, vigilantes have been allowed to be heroes precisely because law enforcement has turned a blind eye and actively participated in the violence against Black and Latino and Asian folks, right? So think about, though, historically, in the lynching era, sheriffs at the jail, stepped aside and let the mob go in and get the inmates that they wanted to lynch, right? Under false claims of rape, that the person was a rapist, right? The police have accepted, really with reckless abandon, allegations of sexual deviance and abuse by Black men in the lynching era. KKK committed violent acts and then got elected to public office, right? Like this notion, you think about going back to the lynching era, that we can't figure out who needs to be prosecuted. We can't figure out who did the lynching when their photographs, public photographs, turned into postcards and distributed all over the country. But somehow we can't figure out who those people are to prosecute them. That's what we mean by silence. And so finally, I would say also, vigilante has been endorsed through sham trials, like when Emmett Till, was killed, right? These sham trials, obviously nobody was going to be convicted in that kind of context. And so I would say now silence, it looks different, but there is silence around, in its own way, police on Black violence, right? So the ways in which for far too long, police officers, I hate to say this, but have been allowed to kill, Black folks under the guise of they were dangerous and they were, a threat. When, right, just again, riding on that narrative. And so that is so critically important until very recently, I think with George Floyd, and it took literally a videotape of the murder on television from beginning.
A 9-minute long videotape.
A 9-minute long video for people to finally say, okay, we now need to prosecute a police officer. But think about how long. And I say that only to say that kind of silence sends a message to civilians that indeed, number one, Black folks are in fact dangerous and do need to be put in their place, and that it's okay. Black lives don't matter, right? They have less value. And so I think the signaling, the silence is a signal, it's a message, it's a condoning of the behavior.
Right. Okay, so then let's transition into, like, now that we have this base ground, I think this is great. Let's transition into how this plays out in our everyday lives in different sources that are really easily accessible, mainly apps and different technology, right? And so, like these high profile cases are super important. Like, you talked about Emmett Till, you had other examples. These are really important things, but they're also just like normal everyday people, like my neighbor right now might be doing something to really hurt a child. And so what I want to do is transition into talking about technology. Talking about how technology is playing a role in policing as proxy, and how we may all be a part of it. So I want to start out by launching a poll. And the poll question is, have you ever used any of the following apps for any reason? And so the apps that are here are Nextdoor, Ghetto Tracker, which is just a horrible name and is defunct now, but nonetheless it's here and it's anonymous. So if you've used it, no one has to know you used it. Local government surveillance apps like BART Watch or Fortify Florida, different neighborhood watch face groups, like those types of individualized like neighborhood groups, local private business surveillance groups like Operation GroupMe, which is one that's in DC, or Ring, or Vivid Ring, the camera that's on your door, on your doorbell. And if there are ones that aren't here that you want to throw out that aren't captured in any of these categories, please put it in the chat. But I would love to see for people to let's just get a basis for that. And so I see that Sierra put in the chat the Citizen app. And Sierra, if you want to say where that is in the chat, that would be great too. So we'll get the results of the poll. Okay, so 59% of people here have used, of the people that responded have used Nextdoor. Nobody has used Ghetto Tracker. 7% on BART, 39% Facebook groups, which, makes sense given how they're used sometimes. Small percentage of local private businesses. Yes, surveillance groups. And then lastly, about 43% ring. So, okay. So before we start to talk to Jason about these apps, we want to watch a little clip of a video that discusses the foundation of the Nextdoor app, and then we'll jump into a discussion with Jason about a broader discussion about more apps. So we'll go ahead and start the video.
Tap into your neighborhood. That's the slogan for Nextdoor, the local social media app used by 1 in 4 American households. The service acts as a public message board for neighborhoods where users can sell furniture, organize events, and alert neighbors of danger.
We're well over 78,000 people now connected to our Nextdoor community throughout the city of St. Louis.
That's about a quarter of the population of St. Louis. In the past year, monthly active users on Nextdoor grew 20%. It's provided neighbors and public agencies a platform to spread useful and important information during the pandemic.
We see neighbors putting their hands up to help. We see neighbors putting their hands up to be helped. And it is so uplifting to just see kindness and humanity coming to the fore, even in the middle of a crisis.
This poster said, anyone who needed help, maybe getting groceries or running errands. He's a young, healthy guy, and he's more than happy to help out his neighbors. And I thought, oh, wow, that's a really good idea, and I would like to do that too. I just never thought of that.
But the app, along with crime-focused apps like Citizen and Amazon's Neighbors, has been scrutinized for years for not doing enough to curb the racism prevalent on the platform.
Somebody can post the sky is blue, and by the 5th or the 10th post, it's turned into an all-out war on Nextdoor.
It has become a kind of digital superhighway for racial discrimination, for unconscious bias or very conscious bias about who belongs in your neighborhood and who doesn't, and who's suspicious and who's not.
Unlike Citizen and Neighbors, Nextdoor is more than a crime-fighting app. It helps small businesses connect to their local customers and gain new customers with free business postings. Local news outlets, which have been dwindling for years, have used the platform to reach a larger local audience with articles that are relevant to their communities. But its reputation as a public safety tool has drawn criticism.
Some have argued that this is basically neighborhood watch on steroids. You're giving people in the community and neighborhoods the tools to monitor their fellow neighbors, and that can go out of hand very quickly.
Okay, so Jason, we're going to turn to you as our expert on these apps. You're going to school us a lot on this, I'm sure. So you've written extensively about technology and racial bias, and one of the things that you've written is looking suspicious. Websites and apps for sharing crime and safety have been outlets for racial profiling. We're going to drop that in the chat so people can get it. So to get us started, we really would like you to tell us about the different types of seemingly innocuous technology that's being used to surveil Black and Latino people. That clip talked about it a little bit, but we just want to hear more from you about it.
I mean, it's a big question. We'll focus on some of the apps that you put up in the poll, but I think like the important thing to take away before we get to those specific apps that Chris writes about so well in her book is like, this is the modern economy, right? Like every tool in our phone is a surveillance tool, right? It's not just because something is billed as a police or community safety or public safety tool, does that then arise it to surveillance? Like, Amazon is a surveillance company, right? Beyond the fact that it owns Ring now. Facebook is a surveillance company, regardless if it has public safety posting communities on there. So I think that's one important thing to look at. And then when it comes to these social networks, whether it's Nextdoor, Facebook, Reddit, like it's really hard to enforce community rules that are going to treat people with dignity. It doesn't have to be, but we basically set up the system so it is, because all of these companies are given a bunch of money from venture capital firms that are expecting a 10x return on their investment. And the only way you can do that is with breakneck growth. And so community rules that would set standards get in the way of that 10x return. And so you can't have both, right? Like you can't have thoughtful, progressive in like the numbers sense, growth on a platform, but also keep your investors happy at the same time. So those things can't coexist simultaneously. But then when we start looking at these different types of tools, I think there's like three major categories, at least on the consumer side. We could obviously talk about the way police use surveillance technology and where that can overlap. But I think for the sake of today's discussion, there's three obvious places to talk about. It's social media, it's home security, and what I'll just consider like vigilante apps. When it comes to social media, we're talking about Nextdoor, which you showed the video on, the Facebook groups, Reddit. If anyone remembers the Boston Marathon bombing about a decade ago, in very short order, a bunch of people got organized on Reddit to basically go find the people that had laid and executed on the bomb that killed people at the Boston Marathon in 2013. Reddit found two names of two brown college students nearby, and those became the point of reference for who law enforcement should be coming after. So the online sleuths went after these two guys, and then ultimately the FBI and local law enforcement also took these as leads. So it's a place where, you know, this started as something that existed within an online community that then bled into actual policing decisions. And I think that is very illustrative of how these tools can be used beyond, like, you know, Nextdoor is chronic for cases of, you know, walking in a neighborhood while black type posts, right? Like, the person's not doing anything wrong besides the fact, you know, their hood's up and their skin is darker than maybe the average skin tone of that neighborhood. Comes to home security, and I know this might be a question later, so I won't go too deep. Ring and the associated Neighbors app has put security cameras everywhere. If the government came to us and said, we have this plan where every house in America is going to have a camera on its front door so we can just keep everyone safe, people would lose their goddamn minds over that idea. And yet, when it comes to package theft, which was the whole tip of the spear to get these things everywhere, people were happy to do that. So it's crazy. You have other questions about Ring. I'll leave it there for right now. But home security is definitely playing a part. And then these vigilante apps, Citizen, which I saw come up in the chat as well. Initially, when it launched, it was literally billed as a vigilante app. It was recommending that people go toward crime and then potentially intervene, which of course got them in all sorts of trouble, and they no longer brand themselves that way. And now they're technically like a crime awareness app, I think is how they would define themselves. But like, the problematic aspect of these tools is no different. They're constantly sending users of the app push notifications to not only, back in the day, encourage vigilantism, but to overload users with notifications to drive engagement and get them onto paid services, basically through the form of fear that Chris was talking about in some of her opening statements, which is like, that's a bad feedback loop. Right? Like, if you've got to scare people for what's going on in your neighborhood for you to make money, then you are incentivized financially to scare people. And so all the harms that Chris lies out in this chapter that she's written get to the heart of that. And they're going as far now as, like, they've piloted private security forces in LA. They're trying to push into Ukraine and Russia as a growth opportunity. Like, even like back in the day when they launched, there was a lot of VCs that gave them money that saw them as a social investment. So maybe not as concerned with that 10x money back, but thought they could make public safety better. Even those funders now are uncomfortable with what they see in regards to what Citizen is doing. And so, I mean, the takeaway here is, like, these companies have to make money to survive. They have to make their funders happy, which is what is pushing the type of growth and the lack of standards in these communities. But also, I think the other big takeaway for all of these technologies is that they're not neutral. They're never going to be neutral, right? Like, we act with technology as math, and math doesn't have an opinion. And these things can be good and bad, but they're never going to be neutral. They're never going to be without an opinion baked into them.
Yeah, and they're built on fear, right? And then the currency are Black and brown bodies whose lives are disrupted by this business that they're cultivating. And so Jason, like, those are like private companies, but I do wonder, like, there are some government initiated and maintained companies. Like, for example, BART is like the Bay Area Rapid Transit Watch. like those kinds of things. Like, what about those? Can you tell us about like how those are created and how they operate and like what their incentive is to continue with this practice?
So oftentimes, like the Bahr app, for example, governments basically take a white labeled product that is built by some private vendor, and then they put their information on top of it. They put their brand on top of it. And that's what's true of the Bahr app. Sometimes these are homegrown and the government themselves has their dev team build it. Not in the case here, which is why that tool, at least when I was writing about it 6 years ago, existed in Houston, Boston, and elsewhere, because it was very easy for a government to just pay for the service and then adopt it. The idea is right, that you can use technology to improve public feedback and information in regards to how they're interacting or using public service, right? Like, we want that. We want more feedback from the public in regards to how our democratic institutions function. That on paper is a good thing. But the problem is, like, if you've ever been on Yelp, right? The only time anyone thinks like, I'm gonna go leave a Yelp review, is because you just had a really bad experience somewhere, right? And these tools are no different. And I think the takeaway is like, whether or not like the tool itself is wrong or could be done better. Like if you're gonna name your tool Ghetto Tracker, then like you started in a bad place and you wound up in a bad place. But like, I don't think that's necessarily true for something like BartWatch. But like, if we're gonna be implicitly biased or straight up racist in our real lives, then that's only going to get magnified when we go online, right?
Channeled, right.
Different psychological reasons, like you have some anonymity, like you don't have to show your face, you don't have to see the reaction of the person that you were being terrible to, which
it's Twitter fingers, right? Like yeah,
we're all our worst selves on Twitter, right? Like that's just the way it is. And the same is true for all of these other platforms.
Okay, so you started to talk about Amazon Ring, and as a person who has a camera on my doorbell right now, because it just came with the security system, can you tell us about Amazon Ring and similar programs and why we should be thinking about it within this context?
Yeah, so it started off, again, innocuously enough. People were getting more packages sent to them because of the primacy of Amazon and people shopping more online than in person. And so to combat that, this person started a company, Ring, so that people could have doorbells that had cameras. So if someone stole something, they would know who the thief was. Like, obvious problem, this was the solution that was put forward. It then gets bought by Amazon after it grows exponentially. And now we've got security cameras everywhere. With a level of like surveillance, as I said, that like we would not want the government doing, yet here we are doing it to ourselves. But at the same time, Amazon and Ring are creating partnerships with police departments around the country. And they're getting in trouble with the fact that they are just handing over data to police departments without any type of public format. Like the feedback loop between police departments and Ring is super tight. Like in a lot of cases, like if I was police and I was investigating a crime having to do with Amazon and I wanted some of their purchase information from a user on Amazon, I would have to go get the warrant to go then get that. Ring isn't functioning like that. Ring has a tight feedback loop where if they have a positive relationship with the community that they are in, then they're just handing over the information as it goes. Now those requests are supposed to be public because they got in trouble a couple of years ago because there was something like 20,000 law enforcement requests a year going to Ring, all behind the scenes. And so now they've like shined a little bit of light on it, but without a doubt, it is like greatly expanded beyond what any public program could have done. Basically close CCTV in our communities, in all of our neighborhoods, based on, a click of a button.
So that is nuts, because when I got my, literally it came with the security system, had no idea, didn't even think about it from that point of view. I want to invite our audience to be brave and just if in the chat you use that type of technology, whether it be Amazon Ring or Vivint or anything like that, where you have a camera, just put an I in the chat. I'll start off I, just raise your hand in there. It's okay. That's why we're out here. And while we do that, Jason, I want us to continue watching. There we go. Thank you, Ariana, for being honest. It's true. It just is what it is. I want to continue watching the a section of the clip that we started with. And then Jason, after we watched like 4 minutes or so of this particular clip, I just want to get your thoughts and delve further into the racial bias and racism that comes into play with these technologies. So we're going to launch this video.
Information directly from the city.
Many police departments use the app to report crimes and relay information to the public.
It allows people within the community to organize and to send notices out immediately amongst the community so that they can coordinate efforts with law enforcement, they can coordinate efforts with each other and the city at large. It's been really helpful in helping, communities put neighborhood watch programs together.
But because of unconscious bias or very conscious racism, not all of these ad hoc neighborhood watch programs are for the best. And Nextdoor has found itself again in the company of crime-focused apps like Citizen and Neighbors as a result.
In a utopian vision, it could be a tool in which the community could look out for each other. That, you could keep your neighbors alert of things. But really what we see is that not only has it become, like I said, like a digital superhighway for racially profiling people, but it's also just become a kind of crowdsourced tool for police surveillance.
Nextdoor has done more to distance itself from those police surveillance apps like Citizen and Neighbors. After the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests, Nextdoor removed a controversial feature that allowed neighbors to forward videos and suspicious activity directly to law enforcement. We spoke to 4 community members that have come together to combat racism on the Nextdoor app in their neighborhoods.
We have really reached the conclusion that the crime and safety portion of their platform needs to be dismantled.
Social media apps may also contribute to public paranoia. While violent and property crime have fallen sharply over the past 3 decades, public perception of crime has only dropped slightly and has actually risen since the early 2000s.
If you were laying in bed at night, you would have no idea that somebody walked by your house, paused for a few seconds, and then kept moving. That wouldn't scare you, but now if you get an alert every time that happens, and then you wake up, you see it, you're frightened, why is this person on my stoop? And then you share it to an app like Nextdoor, then all of a sudden, not only you're scared, but your neighbors are scared.
And it's not just what happens on the platform that scares some users. It's what happens offline as a result of online conversations. Fatima says she's seen instances where users have threatened to report their neighbors to their employers for comments made on Nextdoor.
One of our residents, she's an attorney, and she was questioning some legal claim, supposed legal claim. And so the conversation on the thread became, oh, she's an attorney, we can look up her Bahr number and report her.
This Nextdoor neighborhood in my real neighborhood does not look at all like my neighborhood. And so it's a conversation going on between a very select group of people.
Bad trade deals have screwed Ohio. China's winning, workers are losing, and political parties are only concerned with.
Cool, thank you. So we don't endorse what was just up, though. I don't even know who that was, but we don't endorse that. That was just an ad, just letting y'all know. So Jason, so just like fairly briefly, because you talked about this a little bit already, like it's really no coincidence based off of what we just watched that a lot of these apps have racist names because they start from this racist animus, right? So like Ghetto Tracker, we've already talked about. There's a Sketch Factor, there's Good Part of Town. Those are all defunct, but they were there. If you could just tell us a little bit more about how these are being used for racial profiling, like how these different apps and technologies are being used for that purpose.
I mean, for racial profiling specifically, it's, as we were talking about, is we're the worst versions of ourselves when it's online. And then as that video points out, it also makes us paranoid. It was like back in the day, I grew up in the 90s. And so my mom got a lot of her news from Dateline and Stone Phillips. And if you only watched Dateline, the world was a scary, terrible place, just filled with wives getting killed and pedophiles everywhere, right? My mom was always scared when Thanksgiving or Halloween was rolling around and we would be out. She's like, well, we saw the thing on Dateline with the razors and the candy. Right. And now it's Dateline on steroids, right? And it's, as opposed to just being on TV once a night or once a week, it's in our pocket with push notifications going on all the time, designed in a way to capture your attention, right? Like that's what all of these applications are looking for. They're in an attention economy, and they make money when when your eyes are on their particular product. And so that's how this has escalated over the last 2 decades. I think the other thing that's interesting to point out is, and they talked about how Nextdoor got rid of this feature, but giving the information with a push of a button to the police, right? A lot about what apps have been trying to do for the last decade is take some type of interaction that had some form of friction in it, like hailing a cab and paying for that cab, and getting rid of friction, right? That's their innovation. But when you get rid of certain forms of friction, you can make a problem worse. So if you make it less or more frictionless to be implicitly biased in a way that contacts the police, then you're just making it easier to scale implicit bias, right? So it's important for us as we're developing these tools and working in these spaces to think about where is friction good, right? Like friction isn't universally bad. And then the last thing I will say is like, Nextdoor and all these other tools that work with police love to say they're doing something for public safety, but there's no evidence, right? Just like in the same way that Uber for years was claiming that they were getting rid of the drink driving problem, there's no evidence for that, it turns out, right? Like that's not what's happening. It's the same thing with Nextdoor. It's the same thing with cell phone trackers, license plate readers, ShotSpotter, which is the gunshot detection company. They all work with police claiming they are making things more safe, and they have no evidence to show that that's actually working, regardless of how much taxpayer money is spent on those programs.
I love that. One, I wrote down friction isn't universally bad. And two, the fact that there's no evidence that these apps are actually working. They're not actually keeping us safe. It's this weird placebo that actually harms other people is a super strong point to take away. Thank you, Jason. I want to bring in Tom and Chris now. And, as two people practicing in different jurisdictions, Chris, you in DC, Tom, you in California. I want to know if you have encountered any examples of this type of technology being used in a racially biased way, either in your own cases, against you personally, and just like if you've seen it. And before y'all answer, I want to ask the same question to people in the audience, and for them to put in the chat while Chris and Tom talk about if they have encountered these types of apps within their cases. So if you don't mind, just go ahead and put it in the chat. And whichever one of y'all want to go first. Tom, I see you.
Sure. I'll go first. I've had numerous cases where, video footage from the Ring app was used as an exhibit, but at the end of the day, to kind of piggyback along what Jason was saying, it wasn't preventative of crime, and it was more of like the placebo effect. None of those cases actually identified my client as the quote unquote perpetrator. All it did was provide grainy video surveillance that the police actually just sent a letter to Ring in order to obtain, or obtained freely from the homeowner. One case that I could think of in particular was a residential burglary spree as alleged by the prosecution. And then another one was a sexual assault case where there was footage of an encounter, but no identifying information from that. But I will say that it was incredibly easy for the police to obtain that footage, even when the homeowner wasn't home. But going more to the issue of racial profiling or racial bias, whether implicit or explicit, yes, I would say that San Diego in particular, or in general, has had an issue. We don't have BART Watch, we don't have things like that, but there was a pilot program initiated by the police department for smart light cameras, right? So cameras that are different lampposts or traffic lights throughout San Diego that are essentially running a feed that only the police has access to. And the issues with this, or that came with this, were that they were being placed or located in communities of color or neighborhoods that had a largely minority population. So aside from the fact that they weren't in La Jolla, which is predominantly white and wealthy, or they weren't in other neighborhoods that are known to be, wealthy, they were used to target these quote unquote high crime areas where minorities lived. And what obviously the the city of San Diego, the city council banned them. But who's policing the police? So we still don't know how they're being used. If they're being used, they are still there. And there have been cases, especially in downtown and Southeast San Diego, while all of a sudden there is this type of smart light footage that comes to view that the police are able to provide to the prosecution to assist the case. But the location of those cameras, I think, shows an implicit bias against people of color, especially considering when you look at other communities in San Diego, which still have a crime rate, they're not present there.
Thank you, Tom. Chris, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I guess I would say similarly, one of the best examples out of DC was Operation Group Me, which is also defunct, right? But that was an app that was created when our Georgetown subdivision, residential subdivision or business district, partnered with our local Metropolitan Police Department to give business owners, police officers, community members a way to communicate with each other and send messages of quote unquote people acting suspicious in the business district, in the Georgetown business district. And so there was a study done, according to data collected over about a 9-month window, more than 90% of the images that were shared through Operation Group Me were of African Americans. And just to give like a couple of just real quick examples, there was a store at the time called American Apparel. And one of the employees from that clothing store sent out a lookout saying suspicious shoppers in the store, 3 female, 1 male with a strong smell of weed, all African American, please help. That was the initial lookout. Another employee from another store responded, what did they look out? The first employee responds, ratchet, LOL. I mean, it's just absolutely appalling. And just for people who are not familiar with the terminology, ratchet is a slang term for trashy. It often has racial connotations. And they thought it was funny, LOL. Another, just a second quick exchange, was a men's clothing store took a photograph, somebody came in the store, of a beautiful, tall, elegantly dressed African-American man wearing distressed jeans, a gray scarf, and a long brown coat. The store employee issued one of these little messages through the app, and it said, African-American male just left, headed up towards 29th Street. He's about 6 feet tall, tattoos on his neck and hand, very suspicious, looking everywhere. This is what's fascinating about it. Another clothing store down the street, it was a suit store, replied and said he was just in the suit store, made a purchase of several suits and some gloves. So just by the grace, right? Like that somebody else was like, the man just came in my store and bought multiple suits. And yet you all are like sending this stuff out. So that's just, I think it's just a perfect example of how these gets used. And really there was absolute public outrage. And I got to say, the media was very helpful bringing this all to light, and those kinds of apps get shut down. But that hits all the things that you and Jason, Ebony, have been talking about. It was government sponsored, right? Like, or at least, partnered, the business district partnered with the police department, and they were using it. And literally, we are our worst selves. I love that, Jason. That's my word, what I wrote down. We are our worst selves on these anonymous, apps, So anyway.
And if I could add one thing really quick, just for like the lawyers in California in particular, California has since codified in the Penal Code section 745, the Racial Justice Act, right? And so it's taken the step forward to prevent these implicit or explicit biases, not just through policing, but through proxy. So websites like Nextdoor can be sources of information to pursue these motions where the remedy is anything guaranteed under the Constitution. They keep it vague, but ultimately it says it could be dismissal if anyone, including the police or a witness in a case, shows implicit or explicit bias racially against another witness even, or your client. So while these websites can be nefarious, racist, awful, at least in California, we can now use those to our advantage to assist our clients in those cases.
And we're going to delve into that more time when we talk about the Edgerrin case in a little bit. And like, honestly, we could talk about these apps for like this entire session. But I do want to transition into a connecting part. So like these apps are, what we've been talking about, like this like protection and this fear, and it's really all about protecting white space. And in the chapter, Chris, talks about this idea of, protecting white spaces and talking about whiteness as this treasured property. So for this section, I want to bring in Chris and Noël to, really tease this out. And so to start off, Chris, you wrote it. I just want to ask you what you mean by this when you talk about protecting white space.
Yeah, so I borrow from Professor Cheryl Harris, and she talks about this concept of whiteness in and of itself as a cherished property, sort of referring to this idea, this power, privilege, resources, opportunity, access that membership in the white race gives to white people, regardless of their socioeconomic class, right? So historically, white Americans have collaborated across class lines to protect that power, privilege, and space in the era of slavery, lynching, legalized segregation, and now I would say, mass incarceration. But, sticking historically for a moment, even folks from a lower socioeconomic class, or I should say it this way, if you are from a lower socioeconomic class, whiteness, this notion of whiteness becomes even more valuable as a commodity that we want to hold on to at all costs, right? And so even though racial segregation or legalized racial segregation is no longer permitted, some, white folks don't want to let Black folks in their neighborhood. Think Ahmaud Arbery here, right? Killers thought he was out of place, right? Think about all the other cases in which a Black person was shot and killed because they were perceived to be out of place. And I imagine, Noël will talk to us much more about that, but think about, Renisha McBride, who knocked on the door of Theodore Wafer in Dearborn Heights, Michigan at 4:40 in the morning after a car accident. That's what people do. You need help. And he kills her. Brennan Walker, little child, teenage boy, newly moved into Rochester Hills, Michigan. He gets lost. He goes up to the house of Dana and Jeffrey Ziegler to just get directions to how to get to school. He gets shot and killed. Trayvon Martin, right? Killed by George Zimmerman, who thought he was out of place. I'm tired of all of these, thugs or, Black males coming into and burglarizing their neighborhood. And here's the thing, the last thing I'll just say is thinking about how powerful this notion of whiteness as a commodity. Zimmerman wasn't, white right? But yet Zimmerman, right, was a member of this community, lived in this community and wanted to protect his own access to whiteness as property, whiteness as space. So he aligns himself and fights, to protect that. So this is what we mean, certainly what sort of Cheryl Harris writes about, this notion of whiteness as property and the need to protect white space.
Yeah. Wanting to protect access to whiteness. That's like descriptive. That's great. It's a horrible concept, but it like accurately describes that thought process. So Noël, the song that we use to actually start the session is called Neighbors. It's by J. Cole, and it's actually like based off of this thing that happened to him where he moves into this really nice neighborhood, this mostly white neighborhood, and he's, this rapper, and because his neighbors see him and all of his Black friends, they call the police on him and they think that he's selling dope. And in the actual video of the song, it's actually surveillance footage of the SWAT team busting into his back door when he wasn't there, right? And so that really, as we were picking this song to start this session, as we were looking at your book, a quote that from your book that stuck out to me you said such killings, talking about the killing of African Americans by police and vigilantes, such killings happens when the racially oppressed are perceived as not knowing and or remaining in what is deemed to be their proper place. In other words, entering into white spaces. Can you expound on what you mean by that, and like what's the root and basis of that for you?
Joe Fagan and Melvin Sykes, in their book, their book on everyday racism, refer to that phenomenon as the racially motivated blocking of space. And I think that even middle-class African Americans have experienced that on a fairly regular basis, when we are oftentimes asked in a not so very helpful way, may I help you?
Mm-hmm.
You're not supposed to be in that particular space. Now, in my comments, I'm going to focus specifically on what I know best, and that's the vigilante and police killings of African Americans. And you mentioned my Killing African Americans book. And in that book, I state that such killings function as a racial control mechanism, which when left unchallenged, terrorizes many African American people into curtailing their aspirations for full and safe freedom of movement beyond what has historically been deemed their proper racial place. And I also trace the criminalization of African Americans back to the debt peonage system of economic exploitation in the United States. Now, in specific reference to African American youth, I state that the killers are often provoked because due to the civil rights and other advances made by African Americans, to put it in very crude Jim Crow era terms, many of today's young African Americans and Latinx Americans don't know their place. Instead, they behave as if they actually expect to be treated as fully enfranchised citizens. While it is commonplace for European Americans, as you know, to ask questions and to proclaim their constitutional and other rights during encounters with the police without being harmed, the violence young African Americans and Latinx Americans experience when they attempt to do so sends a clear racial control message that, consistent with Judge Taney's ruling back in the 19th century, what he concluded much earlier, it is the racially dominant group that is in control, and that Black people had best stay in our place and to behave as white men with guns would have us to behave.
Thank you, Noel. And so can we, and so like, I think that's wonderful. That's a wonderful point about these spaces, about what can happen when Black boys and girls don't know their so-called place. Are there other aspects of white life that are being protected also in these contexts, like property, identity, things like that? Like, what are the other things that are being protected within these contexts?
Well, yes, it's not just the protection of white life and property. If you really want to focus on racial oppression, then you have to focus on socioeconomic status, which is a combination of economics, politics, and social status. And so this type of police and vigilante behavior protects white economic well-being. It protects white politics in terms, you can clearly see that in the Trump administration. If it wasn't for racism, I tell my students that we should almost feel sorry for the Republican Party now, because if it wasn't for racism, they would have nothing. And then social status. The lowest so-called white man can feel superior to the highest person of African American status. And the criminalization of African Americans makes them feel really, really good and really superior. For example, I periodically, even when I'm walking as a 74-year-old African American man, I'll walk next to a European American woman and she'll grab her purse, as if I'm some criminal who's interested in stealing her purse. Well, some of that may be a little bit of fear, but you have to understand where that fear comes from. That fear comes from the racism that she's internalized about me and people who look like me. But there's other parts of that reaction that has to do with, I am morally superior to you. I am a good person. You are a bad person. And moral superiority is almost always at the heart of racism. If you look at Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, when the slave masters came to get her and her child, and they were riding in that wagon, their shoulders were upright and they were morally self-righteous, and they were outraged by the fact that she would do something like kill her child or infant baby, rather than have it be a part of slavery. So yes, all three of those, the economic, the political, and the social status, form what we sociologists refer to as socioeconomic status. And that's what these various mechanisms of racial oppression, let's call it what it is, that's the function that they serve.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you. And I want to now take us into adolescence and childhood and apply this to Black children. So like we're talking about protecting white space, I want to now talk about how that process of people trying to protect this space, regardless of their race, trying to protect their proximity or their access to whiteness, how that impacts the developmental process of the young people who are the butt of that ignorance. And so Kris writes in her book that vigilante justice is particularly effective against adolescents because it seeks to impose limits and boundaries before their identities are fully formed. And like I've read Kris's book a couple of times by now. I read it once a month actually, and for these trainings. But that really struck me because all of these things that we're talking about interrupt the natural process of adolescent development for young people. And this is like another example. So we want to play some of a video. So like for those of you all who have attended some of trainings that Kris has done, particularly the implicit racial bias trainings, you've probably seen this video. It's a clip from a TV show called What Would You Do? And we typically show it to, show implicit bias and how it plays out. But for this particular time, what we want to do is show you the reactions of everyday citizens who are interacting with children of different races who they perceive to be doing something that's wrong. So we're going to launch the video and watch it for a second.
You see this and you wonder, did he lose his keys or is he blatantly stealing that bike? In broad daylight, he hammers and then saws on the chain. When that doesn't work, he pulls out an industrial-sized bolt cutter. And when he's asked, he fesses up.
You lost the lock? No, not exactly.
But he's not a real thief. Justin Kelly is an actor, and our hidden cameras are rolling.
What happened? Nothing. I can't get through the lock. I mean, I know this is weird, but you wouldn't happen to know whose bike this is, would you? No. All right, good. Thank you.
It was odd that somebody had all that equipment.
But you didn't do anything.
No? That's true.
That's the bottom line.
Lots of people stop and stare. A few even question the actor.
I guess I have to ask, is that your bike?
I guess technically no.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Good luck.
In over an hour, about 100 people pass by. Only George and Arlene try to stop him. Some tell us they plan to call the police later. Others say they're scared. Keep moving. This woman and her friends give our thief the benefit of the doubt. When we ask why, Bisa Washington tells us first impressions matter.
I remember thinking young white men don't usually carry burglar tools.
So we all make assumptions, huh?
Yeah. I'm thinking maybe he works for the park.
We replace our white thief with this young man, Matlock. Remember, both actors dress in a similar way and are about the same age.
Is that your bike?
Nah.
Then what are you cutting the chain for?
Right away. Right away, somebody yelled. Wow. Within seconds, another person confronts our thief.
Is that your bike? Technically, it's not, but it's gonna be mine.
More people converge.
Is that on the cell phone? When you call the police, he's like stealing somebody's bike.
Oh, you taking that bike? That's your bike?
No, it's not, sir.
Oh, why are you doing that?
Is this any of y'all bikes? Is this your bike?
It's not, it belongs
No,
to
but
someone.
whoever's it is.
It belongs to someone.
To who?
Well, not to you.
And sure enough, one man whips out a cell phone to call 911.
Yeah, there's someone taking a bike here.
Our actor triggers more reaction. Some people are even snapping pictures for evidence.
I got you, bud. I got you.
Guy's stealing a bike. Whose bike's over here?
Once everyone moves away, we reset our cameras, and within minutes, another outraged man is yelling.
Are you trying to steal that bike?
Excuse me, sir, but the bike's been here for days. Like, no one's gonna take it.
Well, that's not your bike then.
Yeah,
you can't just come in and take something from somebody.
Excuse me, sir.
Okay, I'll just take your tools away then. This yours, sir?
Please, sir, don't touch my stuff, sir. Please, sir, do not touch my
Well,
stuff.
you're touching
please.
somebody else's stuff.
Yeah, all right, but this has been here. Like, who's gonna take it?
Well, that doesn't make it your property.
Technically, it does.
No, it doesn't technically. It's not yours to take.
All right, sir.
When we bring out our cameras, David Robb wants us to go after the thief.
That kid in the red shirt.
He's hacking away at a bike that's not his.
Days, and he has a right to take it and steal it. And he's come here with...
She may not look like your average bike thief, but actress Ashley Carpenter makes sure anyone who asks.
Okay, so we're gonna
is up to no.
reflect for a sec. Well, I'm just gonna say right quick. I thought it was hella interesting, that last man and the level of indignation that he evidenced with that young boy, thinking that he was, taking this bike. And so I just think that we use that clip to really highlight that people felt like the white boy couldn't be doing anything wrong, but the Black boy was doing something wrong, and to evidence bias. But like I said, we've used it in this context today to really talk about the just like quickness of everybody to act against that young boy. And so, Noah, I saw you come off of mute. So like the question that I was going to ask you is about this fear narrative and like how it's driven against Black youth. And I just want to invite you to answer that question and any other thoughts that you have.
Thank you. That's the question I really want to address, because this fear thing is not what people think. It's almost the opposite of that. The belief that, first of all, if you notice in that video, someone was going to take the young man's tools away from him. Obviously, he was not frightened. The belief that the so-called white spaces must be protected from dangerous African-American youth is bogus. And it's a gross misunderstanding of the role of fear in such harassment, profiling, killings, or what have you. First, let's examine the idea that such killings are motivated by fear that is somehow separate from white racism. Then I'd like us to consider an alternative and a radically different view of the actual place of fear in such oppression, including killings. In my Killing African Americans book, I state that it's important to note the hazards of taking at face value claims of fear as an explanation of police. Their actual impact is likely to be greatly overstated, since police officers and vigilantes know that they're most likely to escape prosecution and conviction if they're able to make a convincing claim that they feared for their lives. It's a get out of jail card, okay? And we saw that with Officer Wilson when he shot Michael Brown. We saw that with George Zimmerman when he killed Trayvon Martin. Indeed, a ProPublica report on racial differences in police shootings notes that the amount of cases of police officers citing officer under attack as the reason they killed increased from a third, 33% of fatal shootings from 1980 to 1984, the year before the US Supreme Court ruled that police could only use deadly force if the subjects were thought to pose a threat to the officer or others, to nearly 2/3, 62% from 2005 to 2009. Now, elsewhere, I'm writing a book on kindness, would you believe? I state that ironically, another factor behind the persistence of such violence is the absence of fear that accrues from the fact that such killings and other abuse have negative consequences, rarely have negative consequences for their killers, the killers of people of these racialized groups. Moreover, it is the lack of such consequences that keeps members of the dominant racialized group from realizing that such killings are wrong. For example, in his study of the evolution of morality and altruism, anthropologist Christopher Boehm helps us understand why that is true by examining the role of fear inducing punishment in the development of conscience. For example, I've studied family violence and I've studied sexual harassment. Before the late 1970s, there used to be cartoons about dirty old men at the office chasing women around the office desk. And there used to be cartoons about Beetle Bailey, cartoons about the general doing the same thing with his female clerical workers. So it was a joke until people started bringing sexual harassment lawsuits. And then, only then did people say, hey, this is wrong. And then they developed a conscience. So we need to understand how people develop conscience. And that is when there are consequences for actions. It happens for young children, it happens for adults. And I go on to state that my basic assumption for my argument about the fact that we need more fear in such situations, not less, is first, it is the lack of cross-group empathy, plus the fear of African Americans who have been stereotyped and dehumanized as dangerous Black criminal others that provoke such killings and allow them to occur with relative impunity. Second, it is through social movement efforts to build empathy for the well-being of African Americans as articulated in the slogan, for example, Black Lives Matter, that such fear-driven political violence can be addressed, assuming that activists are able to overcome the inevitable white backlashes they provoke. And we saw that backlash to the George Floyd racial justice movement recently. Third, while that fear reduction and resulting empathy building are essential for such movements, they alone are not sufficient to their success. And finally, and ironically, the other essential factor that needs to stop those killings and other forms of harassment is the actual evoking of sufficient fear. First, fear for the well-being of the targets of such killings. That's just basic human empathy. And second, the fear in both those who carry out and those who condone such actions. The fear that is necessary for them to no longer happen without people being held accountable for their actions or their inactions. So my basic point is in terms of these police vigilante killings, harassments, what have you, is that the problem is not fear, that's bogus. What we actually need is more fear.
Because it's the lack of consequences, right? There's the lack. Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
No, I was almost just about to do an amen, then I realized that was inappropriate. This notion that,
right.
This idea of the lack of fear. We should be, afraid of the harm to Black children who are criminalized through these actions, right? And we should be afraid of the killers, of George Zimmerman's and the like. So I'm just sorry. It was just an amen corner. My apologies.
Yeah, no, and yeah, and right. It's the need for accountability, right? It's the need for Black lives to mean something, for Latino lives to mean something, and not in proximity to whiteness.
Yes, I can just summarize the cause of all of this mess, whether it's racial profiling, harassment, brutality, or killings. It can all be summarized in one word, one 5-letter word: power. Okay, people, and I can take a whiteboard that's 12 miles long and write all of the 10,000 factors and variables in their interrelationship. But the solution to all of this craziness is also one word: power. We have to change power relations.
Absolutely. And so let's delve further into talking about the power that's held by individual citizens as it relates to our young clients who are Black and Latino and members of historically oppressed groups in this country. And so we want to talk about like some actual cases. I mean, so we talked about this, I wouldn't say abstract, but we haven't talked about like actual children, like real children that we can like touch and know and like saying their names. So we're going to transition into a conversation talking about the Edgerrin case with Tom. But before we do that, we want to play a clip about the murder of a 15-year-old girl in the 90s named LaTosha Harlins. So this video is going to explain what happened to LaTosha, when it happened, who did it to her. I want to let you know that for the first 35 seconds of this video is fairly difficult to watch. So we have included it because of the, for a couple reasons. One, the voiceover gives a really clear accounting of what happened. And two, this happened to her. Like this happened. So I'm giving a trigger warning right now. Excuse me, I'm giving a trigger warning right now. If you would like to look away for the first 35 seconds, you can, and I'll type in the chat when it's fine to look back. But we're going to play this video and then have a discussion with Chris and Tom afterwards about the real impact on our youthful clients.
This grainy security camera videotape graphically depicts the last few moments of 15-year-old LaTosha Harlins' life.
Store owner Soonja Du thought 15-year-old LaTosha Harlins was going to steal some orange juice.
She had the money in her hand. You could see the money in the videotape. And the suspect grabbed the backpack, and there became a physical altercation over the backpack. And as our victim turned to walk away from the scene, the suspect raised a weapon and shot the victim in the back of the head.
LaTosha was an A student, honor roll student. She got money every week for her allowance, so she did not have to steal orange juice.
The store clerk, a Korean woman, is now in jail. The Black community is outraged over the killing. The NAACP is demanding the clerk be tried for murder.
Stop killing our children! We want justice!
Please read the verdict. Title of court and cause. We, the jury, in the above-titled action, find the defendant, Soonja Du, guilty of voluntary manslaughter in violation of Penal Code Section 192A.
It is not a time for rhetoric, which serves no purpose other than to fuel the fire. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire that's already burning. It is my opinion that Mrs. Du is not a danger to the community, and that she is not going to reoffend.
I know a criminal when I see one. I know a person who presents a danger to the community when I see one. When I don't, I treat that person as something other than that.
She got away with murder.
I damn sure hope so, that there would be all the hell in the Black community.
Somebody would care.
Would stand up and see this insanity for exactly what it is. Black people once again being unjustly treated by this.
Stay on the street.
Get his hand on the back.
Since we don't pick cotton anymore and cut sugar cane, our lives is not worth anything.
So before we turn to Tom, I just want to say that every time I hear the story of what happened to LaTasha, how ridiculous it is from beginning to end, always just hits me like a ton of bricks, like how she was actually murdered and then how the court system chose to deal with it. And so like, I just want to say that, listen, the idea, the reality of mass incarceration is a whole other discussion, like how we handle criminal justice in this country. That's a whole other discussion. But it's really about the disparate treatment of this case compared to if LaTasha were a white girl, right? Like, or if Miss Dew was a Black person, right? But honing in here, this is a 15-year-old child who, by the words of her family, is, this model person, and she is shot in cold blood, right? And Judge Joyce Carlin, I like to say their names when they do these things, made a decision that I undoubtedly believe that she would not have made if LaTasha were not Black. And so that is a judgment about the value of this Black child, right? And that is what's underneath a lot of these 911 calls that are behind these civilian complaints, is a deeply held racist feeling about, in this case, we're talking about young Black boys and girls and young Latino boys and girls. So that was fairly unscripted, but I just wanted to say that. And I want to turn to you, Tom, because you have had up close and personal with working with a case that had one of these. And so you were the trial attorney in the Edgerrin case, and it's a case where your client was arrested when a alleged 911 call came through stating that there was a tip from a female driver that there were Black males acting shady. So I'd like to just have you walk us through the various pieces of Edgerrin and just first start with what you learned from the initial police report and preliminary hearing.
Sure. So being that Edgerrin was a juvenile, we didn't have a preliminary hearing. The first hearing that we had to air any of this out was the actual suppression motion. But leading up to that, there were a number of issues that just right off the top of reading the police reports didn't seem right, along with the charges. So Edgerrin was charged with multiple offenses, which would constitute strikes in the state of California, meaning that they would follow him around for the rest of his life. And if he ever got in trouble again with a felony, he would be looking at mandatory prison time as opposed to any opportunity at probation, unless a judge or a DA decided to strike the strike. So just looking at the police reports initially, it was trying to piece together how Edgerrin was even detained, searched, or the police came into any of their evidence. And through each police report, there were 4 officers who detained Edgerrin and the occupants of his vehicle. There were 3 other African-American youth in his vehicle. So there were 2 police reports from those 4 officers. And then there was a detective who wrote multiple reports as well. And each report that they wrote started off with a little thumbnail describing their involvement in the investigation. All of these officers were members of the GSU, known as the Gang Suppression Unit. And I have a strong distrust for officers in that unit because I have known or experienced their dishonesty, their bias towards different communities, and the way in which they police. But each report started off by saying, we were in patrol of this area, in this area conducting surveillance, when a woman, no description whatsoever, approached our vehicle and informed us that there were 4 Black youth in a car, a Black Mercedes, acting shady. So the police in their reports wrote that was the impetus, the reason for which they started their investigation, a report of shadiness, which in and of itself provides zero information related to criminality, any kind of reasonable suspicion for criminality, or probable cause to even arrest someone. But based on this report of shadiness, the police, 2 vehicles deep, activated their car lights, pulled up kind of one positioned just outside the other. So it was apparent there were 2 police cars right behind this black Mercedes, which was legally parked, by the way. And each officer got out and covered a doorway to prevent any of the youths from the vehicle to exit. And so that was how the detention or the initial investigation per the police reports into Edgerrin started. My co-counsel, Audrey Q, represented Jamar, who was one of the other youth who was arrested in this case as well. And so once we saw this and we read about the report of Shady, we talked about strategy, about going forward, about pursuing a suppression motion, but knowing how dishonest the gang unit can be and knowing their tactics, we wanted to make sure that we had our bases covered. So we made sure to request any CAD reports, which are computer-aided dispatch. So whenever an officer in San Diego is on an open communication line with another officer, it is reported by dispatch in a log, and there are sometimes code used, sometimes just shorthand sentences explaining the nature of a contact with an individual. We requested any and all body-worn camera on the case because even though the detention we know would be captured, we wanted to see who this quote unquote citizen was that provided this tip of shadiness. Because with the body worn cameras, at least in San Diego, and I don't know if it differs in different jurisdictions, when the police activate it, it records at least video for the 2 minutes prior to any detention. The audio is sometimes not present, but at least you could see whether or not there was a real and legitimate interaction. Edgerrin's family, his father was charged, and this is kind of a long story, so I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of it. But his father was previously charged in a homicide, a gang-related homicide of a police officer back in the late 80s, early 90s. And he was a group of African-American males who was charged in that case that went to trial multiple times and hung at least the first time and involved a cooperating witness. It later came to light that the gang unit at the district attorney's office here and the police department engaged in egregious police misconduct. So bad that a judge sitting on the San Diego Superior Court granted a habeas petition and reversed the jury's findings of guilt as to all of the defendants in that case. And the case ended up resolving for credit for time served for all of those individuals because it was such rampant misconduct involved. The link was just put out in the chat so everyone could take a look at that when they want. But based on that, my client's father was one of those people who was charged, who was eventually given credit for time served, and his family had become a target of the police ever since. So we tried to do what we can to, one, either establish that there was actually a citizen tip, and two, to get any and all information that the DA knew, that the police knew leading up to this detention, to see whether or not it was actually a legitimate investigation or some kind of pretextual stop based on race, which I think the word shady, as used in this context, certainly has those racial implications as well.
Right. And so, excuse me, so let's talk a little bit more about the tip. And so, like, I just want to point out for the youth defenders and the audience that the various practice skills that Tom is laying out are super helpful in terms of laying out what the investigation looks like, the types of discovery that you want to do, the types of things that you want to do to beef up and prep up for your motion to suppress. And it also drives home not taking these statements of police officers at face value, because as Tom said, sometimes cops lie, right? And so, Tom, I want to dig into the tip a little bit. So earlier you talked about a California law that allows you to get certain information about certain tips. Can you talk to us about how you use that law?
So, well, with this case, the penal code for juvenile cases is actually, well, it's the Welfare and Institutions Code in California, but it allows us to obtain discovery easier, and it's much more open in terms of what has to be disclosed to us. So my client at the time was on probation for another offense. Okay, he did have a Fourth Amendment waiver, which did extend to not only his personal possessions, but also electronically. Knowing how the gang unit operates and knowing that the truth is sometimes loosely appreciated with them, I wanted to make sure that through the statute, I was able to get each and every piece of information to cut off every single avenue going forward. So a lot of times with citizen tips, what I've discovered at least too, is that the collective knowledge doctrine also applies, right? Which says police officer believes they have reasonable suspicion and they impute that to or tell another officer through official channels, and that officer also has the ability to conduct an enforcement stop. So I made sure to request any and all communications between those officers on that date, prior to that date, any and all prior contacts with my client, including field interview cards, which would show whether they had met my client before, so they could identify him in the vehicle and know right away that he was a fourth waiver. Because if they didn't know that before the detention is invalid despite the fourth waiver. And as we went through and we started gathering this information, what we learned was, one, they could provide no information regarding the citizen tip. The body-worn cameras did not have any footage of a female approaching their vehicle. And the cameras actually went back and started recording about 3 minutes before they drove to the location where Edgerrin was lawfully parked in this vehicle. We learned that the officers had never had any kind of official communications about this tip of shadiness. We learned that there was no prior contacts documented at the police department with my client, Edgerrin. And so really it left us thinking, what actually happened here in the scenario? How did the police go from shady to detaining my client, searching his vehicle, arresting him, and then obtaining a social media clip which depicted the crime for which he was being charged? And California especially has more protections for social media and other electronic devices regarding to search and seizure. So we gathered all that information leading up to the suppression motion. And with the suppression motion, we filed what's known as a Harvey Madden challenge to make sure that the police brought forth the source of the tip and the reliable information related to the informant. Because if they can't establish that foundation under the Harvey Madden objection in California, that doesn't come in as a hearsay exception for probable cause.
Yeah. So Chris, super briefly, like Tom is talking about California law that will help you get to a confidential informant. Can you just talk about the federal standard in terms of like federal law?
Yeah.
And how it's different.
Sure. I mean, look, Illinois versus Gates is the Supreme Court case, 1983 case in 1983, 462 U.S. 213, Supreme Court case that adopts the totality of the circumstances approach to evaluating the reliability of a tip that, like what Tom is talking about, right? To justify the type of stop and frisk they used in the Edgerrin, or stop and search, actually, in the Edgerrin case. I should note just that Illinois versus Gates is a much laxer standard than the old two-part Aguilar-Spinelli for any, for the lawyers on the call. But all is not lost. So even though we're relying on a totality of the circumstances test to evaluate something like shady, the factors are still relevant that were laid out in the previous cases. So we have to have some dependable basis of knowledge. The tipster, in other words, the police officers have to articulate some dependable basis of knowledge by their tipster, right? So in Tom's case, like, it's not just enough to say, for the police officer to say, there was a tip, woman came up, and said they were shady. You got to tell me, where did they get this information? Where did this woman, what's her basis of knowledge? How long was she looking at this Mercedes Benz? It's more than just rumor and innuendo, right? Also, even under the Gates, Illinois versus Gates standard, the police officers have to establish that the informant was credible. And so, it's similar to what Tom talks about in California. I also want to say that we have Florida versus JL, which is 529 US 266. It's a 2000 case, much more recent than Gates, and talks specifically about the reliability of anonymous tips, right? And in that case, the Supreme Court said that an anonymous tip about an individual at a particular location in possession of a gun was not enough to provide the adequate basis for a stop, a frisk, or a search, even when the police officers arrived at that location and found a person matching the description. It went on to say, and this is really important, I think, for what Tom is talking about, that anonymous tips alone are seldom sufficient to demonstrate the types of informant bases of knowledge and informant veracity and reliability that we need, and that sort of unknown, unaccountable informant information is got to be supplemented by so much more. All the things that that Tom talked about, right? Body worn camera, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's a couple of good cases that you can rely on if you're not in California.
Thanks, Chris. And so I want to make the connection, because often when we think about confidential informants, some of us have watched too much of The Wire, right? And so we're thinking of a certain type of, like, we're leaning into the same racial stereotypes, right? But in this Edgerrin case, I just think it's fascinating that there's this woman who sees something shady. And so the amount of coded language here, like, we all know that when she saw some guys acting shady, she saw some Black boys doing something that she perceived as shady, right? And, Tom, you said something that indicated to me that there is, question of, like, does this woman actually even exist? Is this an actual person? And I just thought it was just fascinating that if it is the case, and it may not be, that these officers conjured up a fake civilian, that they chose a woman who everybody, when they think about who this woman is, pictures a white woman looking at Black boys as being shady. Talk about shady. Like, that in and of itself is, like, just hella shady. Now, on that diatribe, I just want to ask you, Tom, what happened with the case at the trial and appellate level?
So at the suppression motion, Audrey and I talked about how we would, kind of attack everything. And it started with, I would take the lead and Audrey would clean up different aspects related to her client, who was a passenger in the vehicle, since there might be different issues. But the district attorney in that case called two people to testify at the initial suppression hearing. One, the detective who arrived later on scene per her report, and two, an officer who was engaged with the stop, but was one of the people who did not author a report. So when I knew what the witness list was, I had a suspicion that, here we go, they're providing this person to come in and testify because there's no real direct impeachment because they didn't write a report. So what we learned right away is that the DA wasn't necessarily going off of the quote unquote shady report alone to justify the detention and ultimate search. They were also trying to say that these officers knew that my client had a Fourth Amendment waiver because he was on probation. So it ended up being essentially a 4-hour hearing, which was strictly impeachment, where with each officer, well, with the officer and the detective, we would have to walk them down a path and close every single door, and also attack the anonymous tip at that time. So I played the body worn camera from the officer who was up there because he was impeached by essentially common sense in that one, right? They're sitting here saying that they knew who my client was beforehand. They knew he was a fourth waiver. But on the body worn camera, they can't even pronounce his name when they contact him, but he gives them a fake name even before that. And it was clearly a stranger to them at that point. But what we did is we walked the detective down how you write a police report, the chronological order in which you write a police report, how everything is included in a police report that is relevant to your investigation. Your investigation includes the stop. It includes the detention. It includes how you obtain evidence, right? And I always like to throw in a line there to these officers too, because it's kind of one of those questions where it's every answer is a good answer, right? It's you write good police reports. And if they say no, then it's like, okay, well, then you're not an honest officer anyway. And here we go. Let's go have fun with this. Okay. But they love to say as well, yes, I do. And they will oftentimes correct you and say, I write fair and accurate reports. So now you've got their own words to summarize and attack them with. And so this detective got up there and testified that she had been surveilling my client for about an hour and a half beforehand, that she had seen him commit a traffic violation at one point where he was parked in the middle of the street, that when he was parked in the area where he was eventually detained, they had obtained through independent sources, Facebook video or Instagram video that shows the commission of the alleged offenses, and that they were all talking with each other about this. But again, the thumbnail said, we approached the vehicle. They were detained because of a report of shading. So with the officer who didn't write the report, I committed him to his partner's report. I committed him to his partner's report by reviewing it with him, that he and his partner spoke about it. He saw his partner's report. His partner's report was fair and accurate. Yes. So when he got up there and started talking about everything else that wasn't included in that report, he was also impeached by omission and contradiction as well. But with the report of shadiness, aside from having to combat all this information that was never once mentioned in any of the police reports, we still had to combat the tip of shady. So we walked each officer down a path about what shadiness means, and that we walked them into saying, you believe that the word shady gave you reasonable suspicion to detain, right? Yes. You believe the word shady meant a crime had been committed. Yes. Let's talk about that citizen tip here. That citizen tip, they didn't say they saw any weapons that were being brandished by those young males in that car. No. And speaking of that car was parked legally on the street, right? Yes. Wasn't in a red zone. No. Wasn't blocking a driveway. No. Was right next to the curb. Yes. Okay, great. And we just kept going down these avenues and closing off every door and just making the word shady seem, one, racially based, but also innocuous in nature to not even furnish that reasonable suspicion. And what happened was our judge, who was an African-American former gang DA, who generally was great with all of the clients I had in front of him, reverted back to his origins. And he said, this was a consensual encounter. And my whole argument to him was that they're using the ends of what they found to justify the means. And actually, at one point, and I forgot to mention this, they recalled the detective twice because we still had the issue of the cell phone video. And the detective got up there and I walked her through how you can't access certain videos on social media unless you're friends with a particular person. So unless they're friends with that person, they have to have a warrant to get that social media. And she started giving me everything I needed about, yes, that's how it works. That's how it works. And then I said, okay, you're in possession of this video. Yes. How'd you get it? She claims privilege. And at that point, we go back and forth, and the judge actually struck her entire second portion of her testimony because she wouldn't answer how she obtained it. But the long and the short of it is that the judge eventually said that, look, this was a consensual encounter. There was no detention, which blew my mind, and actually the bailiff's mind in the courtroom too, who couldn't believe the judge didn't see the detention. And so he denied the motion to suppress on those grounds. I know I've been talking a long time, so I'll make this brief. On appeal, what happened was I had a really fantastic appellate lawyer who was appointed on the case. There's no interlocutory appeals in juvenile court, which is unfortunate. So it was after Edgerrin had to make an admission to one offense in the petition. But this appellate attorney and I had a great line of communication. I gave him all the exhibits from the case, the body-worn camera, talked to him about the issues as I saw them. And he went forward and did a fantastic job arguing it in front of our Court of Appeal, where the Court of Appeal actually published in the opinion photographs of the exhibits of the officers surrounding the car, which I hadn't seen up to this point. So it was really a great example of working with appellate counsel as well, but also the court reversed the trial court's ruling and sent it back for a rehearing, but also published a very powerful concurring opinion to its own majority opinion about how racism or racial bias plays a role in the criminal justice system and how it's important that we catch up to dealing with that as opposed to not allowing it to play a role at all in cases like this.
A ride you had, Tom. That was like a long ride and a case for a career. Thank you for the work that you and your co-counsel and the appeals attorney did on that case. So this has been a fascinating conversation. We're not quite done yet, though. We're going to transition into talking about solutions. So we're going to talk about the solutions in a couple of different categories, but I want to start with solutions in individual cases. And so, Chris, I'm actually going to go to you first and ask you what tips do you have for defenders when it comes to attacking this use of civilians within cases who are stepping into the place of police officers?
So I have to say nod to Tom, because he listed a lot, and you did a good job, actually, Ebony, of summarizing key things in an individual case, starting with the fact that we don't take for granted, we don't accept at face value the information from police officers, but that we dig deeper and figure out what exactly is underneath that 911 call or this supposed claim that a witness approached the car. So I think that's huge. I think discovery is huge. I think we have to be vigilant in litigating civilian tips, vague civilian tips. I gotta say, there's no, I'm sad that Tom lost, not, obviously it was a great victory over law, but that the motions court at the outset did not throw out or did not throw out shady, right? That shouldn't, or even worse, I should have gone back even further, that the prosecutor would even move forward, is really what I should have said, move forward with the word shady as the basis for a stop or a frisk. So we got to be vigilant, though, I think, in challenging civilian tips based on vague descriptions. I think we need all of the above. I think actually really Tom has really hit this. It's actually really what I'm thinking about, asking our clients more questions, that I think the way we interview clients has really got to account for the fact that they are being targeted by civilians through tips and the like. So I think that's a piece of it. I also think the narrative, we talk about this a lot in our monthly webinars, but that the ways in which shady, the perceptions, let's say the tip had been real, but that the perception of a civilian that a Black child is acting shady arises out of implicit racial bias in and of itself. And that it's the in and of itself is the criminalization and the perceptions, right, of a Black child doing a childlike thing, sitting and playing on a phone in a car, hanging out with friends, is somehow shady, right? That's what we also need to be challenged in our individual case, shifting that narrative about the language that's being used. So I think that in individual cases, and we could talk about more broader policy stuff.
Cool. Yeah, and so I just want to ask Jason right quick, you talked about the reliability of these apps. Would you be willing to serve as an expert for folks or be able to give us leads on other experts in these cases?
I am happy to be useful to whomever I can, and where my knowledge ends, I'm sure I can find somebody else where their knowledge picks up.
Got him on the hook, guys. We're good. Okay, so now we just want to let's move into talking about legislatively. And so Chris and Tom, which either one of y'all want to talk about this. So are there legislative things that that we as advocates can be doing in order to push back on this? Chris, do you want to go?
Sure. I can just start us off. I mean, one of the things that we sort of, and there's so much we could talk about in policing as proxy. One of the things that we didn't get to talk about was the ways in which stand your ground laws, right? Perpetuate sort of, or, set up the structures by which we're protecting white spaces, right? And so I think, we as defenders should be fighting against stand your ground laws. I mean, for folks who don't know, stand your ground laws greatly expanded an individual's right to defend themselves and their property by removing this duty to retreat. Right. So you're no longer, in some states, have a duty to walk away in order to avoid danger and to prevent yourself from having to use weapons in self-defense. And so, I think we need to be pushing back on those in large part because they have been used racially disparately, right? Ways in which, folks and folks like Trayvon Martin, like George Zimmerman and some other folks have been emboldened, right, to claim that they are rightfully protecting their space, even when, even when that's not quite, the law isn't quite designed to protect that. I should note in the Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman case that that case ultimately did not legally rest on a stand your ground defense. It was a straight self-defense claim, but the whole conversation in the media was about how Zimmerman in Florida had the right, to stand his ground. And in fact, after the media flurry in that case, stand your ground laws were strengthened thereafter. So I just think that's another place that we as defenders can fight and resist legislatively. I think we need to fight. We need to join Jason, not just in calling him as an expert in our individual cases, but calling, Jason before legislative bodies, right, to testify about the harms and the ways in which the unreliability of those apps that are being used to call in police, notify police of suspicious behavior by Black folks. So that's just two examples that that occur to me.
So we're at time, but I do want to offer the rest of the panel a opportunity to very briefly, if you have other ideas about how youth defenders can fight back, if you could provide those in 30 seconds or so. I just want to open up the floor to anybody that has anything to say in terms of guidance to the youth defender community.
I would just take the opportunity to lift up the work of some other groups. We saw Electronic Frontier Foundation being discussed on the Next Door video. Obviously, the ACLU's privacy and technology work is important in this space, but also groups that this community might not be familiar with, like Colors for Change has the Black Tech Agenda that has a lot to do around algorithmic accountability, misinformation, and other issues we've discussed here, as well as the Algorithmic Justice League, which came out of a really solid work out of MIT. And so just to keep an eye on those things, both legislatively, but also just to understand how technology isn't neutral.
Thank you. And Tom, I think I saw you come off mute.
Oh, what I was going to say is that California, I would just encourage everyone, and this is more of a quote from my co-counsel on this case, Audrey Q, is to be brave, right? Don't be afraid to challenge these things. Don't be afraid to look past face value in terms of what's being reported in the police reports. There's not a single time I've ever been to court, had a single hearing where everything came out as it's written in the police report. And there's a reason for that, right? But also, if your jurisdiction doesn't have it, then you have any impact with legislative laws or the advancement of laws to prevent this kind of explicit or implicit violence or bias against people in the criminal justice system. Take a look at California's Racial Justice Act. It's brand new. And I say that because it's, I think, a couple years old now. But we're finally getting legs, at least in San Diego, with litigating these issues under that act. And if you could put forth something like that with your legislature, or figure out a way to propose legislation along this line, I think that's at least a step forward in trying to prevent the implicit bias or explicit bias that the system presents.
Thank you, Tom. Noel, do you have any parting thoughts for us?
Yes, again, I would like to encourage us to put all of this in a larger context of the fact that African American are an oppressed people, and Latinx people are oppressed as well. And so we have to do what it takes to change power relations. And we can't just focus on this issue isolated and this issue isolated and the 10,000 things that go along with oppression. We have to go to the root of all of this. We have to recognize that ultimately we're dealing with political violence, and that we're dealing with a political problem that has to be changed politically by changing power relations. Now, you know, with this Trump era of racism and this authoritarian movement in this country and this willful ignorance of people with guns, we need to think in terms of how to protect our communities and our children. And we may have to resort to some measures that ordinarily we would not have to resort to, but considering the situation that we're in, fighting for our very survival. For example, in my Killing African Americans book, I talk about two types of solutions. One is fundamental solutions aimed at fundamental change. And then I talk about just making things better, the ameliorative solutions. So the fundamental change solutions might involve economic boycotts, programs of non-cooperation, including jury nullification, refusal to pay taxes, refusal to serve in the military, general strikes and slowdowns, and when necessary, the establishment of armed organizations for self-defense. And I really don't think we're that far away from having to take those kinds of measures. The making things better actions, I list 14 of those in my concluding chapter. But I'll just mention some of them here, not all 14. Establish local, state, and national data centers and archives for all police and vigilante killings. I'm going to focus on the killings here. Establish a legal defense hotline of pro bono lawyers to advise people of their rights before and when possible during and after their encounters with law enforcement officers and vigilantes. Encourage whistleblowing by police officers and others employed within the criminal justice system by providing them with the financial, legal, media, and other supports that they need. Monitor and make public the records of the handling of local police and vigilante killings by mayors, police chiefs, prosecutors, and judges. And just a few more. Distribute smartphone apps to advise those confronted by the police and vigilantes to record those encounters on cloud-based servers. Bring lawsuits that challenge existing laws and court rulings regarding when the police, when vigilantes may use legal force. Make appeals to the United Nations to investigate and monitor the persistence and disproportionate police and vigilante killings of African Americans as a violation of their human rights and its anti-genocide pact. So I conclude with my book, as I'll conclude here, that ultimately it is power that explains oppression, and it is only by changing power relationships that people can end it. No oppressor is going to take his or her foot off of someone's neck because it is the right, the rational, and the reasonable thing to do, as made clear by some wonderful sociological study. That foot can only be removed by us, and only if we can muster the courage and the power to do so. And I go back to Frederick Douglass, who made it very clear that power concedes nothing Without a demand, it never has and it never will.
Yep. And Frederick Douglass also said, agitate, 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 right? We keep going. This panel has been absolutely amazing and beautiful. I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to our leader, Chris Henning, for this wonderful content, providing the space for us to all come with each other. Before we leave, I just want to remind everybody that Ambassadors for Racial Justice is a partnership between Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative with the Gault Center. It is a program that is focused on training youth defenders who want to promote racial justice and do racial justice work. Applications for the program are due on November 11th. We have dropped the link in the chat, so please consider applying or offering or referring someone else who you think may be interested in applying. All of the information, all of the chat links, like all of the links that were dropped in the chat, will make them available after this. Also, the Gault Center has a YouTube page where we have all of our other chapter of the month trainings, as well as this one will be up in a couple of days. You'll be getting an email with all of these materials. And thank you so very much for tuning in. Every time we do one of these, I am just so heartened by the people that come, show up, and are engaged, who are so just very focused on liberating our children. So thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.